Hi, everyone. My name is Neil Byers, and I am a data scientist and impact analyst at the Joint Genome Institute, which is part of Berkeley Lab. And today I'm going to talk about how JGI looks at user analytics and how persistent identifiers fit into all of that. So we'll go ahead and dive into it. So to start, we've heard a lot in this group about how various user facilities are implementing things like DOIs and ORCIDs. Basically, persistent identifiers that make tracking easier, right? So what I'm interested in is what we actually do with these things once they're implemented. Why do we care about more robust user tracking? Why are we going through all of this trouble to adopt things like ORCIDs and DOIs? So the topics I'm going to cover today include a real brief description of JGI's service model, some examples of impact narratives that we can discover, some examples of internal analytics that are enabled by improved connectivity, and how persistent identifiers help enable these things, and then finally a short discussion on why persistent identifiers aren't necessarily a silver bullet in all of this. So let's get right into it. So to start, what is JGI? Well, we're a DOE user facility, a concept with which I'm sure all of you are very familiar. All user facilities are different, though, so I think in the context of this talk, it's worth talking in detail a little bit about how JGI in particular serves its various user communities. So basically, researchers submit proposals to us. These folks are who we call our primary users. They send us samples they've collected in the field. We sequence and process those samples and produce high-quality data products. That data is then added to our flagship data systems where our primary users can retrieve it. It's also really important to note that all of this data is eventually made public. This means that once a short embargo period is over, anyone can make a login and come analyze and download data on our flagship systems and elsewhere. The folks that do this, the members of the public who don't go through our proposal system but who use our public resources, are JGI's secondary users. So our primary users number in the hundreds to thousands, depending on how we define our active users. And our secondary users number in the tens of thousands during any given year. And we produce a ton of data with, I think the number is over 15 petabytes stored in our systems as of this year. So to reinforce this idea of our user categories, JGI's primary users go through our user programs and are associated with at least one JGI proposal. JGI's secondary users make use of JGI's public resources, so our public data, our systems, our tools, and so on. And it's important to note that the primary secondary language here doesn't necessarily mean that one is more important than the other, far from it actually, but rather that one is more closely integrated with JGI's service model and processes, and those would be our primary users. So each of these groups can leverage JGI's services on projects that can lead to a number of outcomes that include, but certainly are not limited to, things like publications and patents and new software and technologies and things like marketable products and methods and standards to make science more efficient, and even startups and grant funding. So JGI has these users. We're providing services that they're leveraging for cool things. As a taxpayer-funded facility, we're motivated to better understand this whole picture, not only so we can talk about how great we are, and of course we think we're pretty great, but also so that we can get better at what we do. And so these two motivations are the ones behind what I'm going to talk about today. So at our first stop, I wanted to show some examples of what impact actually looks like in the context of what JGI does. So it's important to note here that JGI is what we call a fundamental science shop, which means that we don't really do applied science. So, for example, JGI sequencing a genome does not automatically replace the fossil fuels in your car with something more sustainable, as much as we would like that to be the case. The same is true for, I'm sure, the work done at a lot of other user facilities. And so what this means is that the actual impact on people's lives of the work that we do will happen pretty far downstream from us. And this is a really important consideration for thinking about usage and user tracking. That being that the time and the distance between the work that we do and the tangible outcomes we want to see is what makes tracking so important. So let's see what that looks like. So in the mid-2000s, JGI sequenced a few fungal genomes that are later made public on JGI's Genome portal. In 2015, a decade after the work originally began, some secondary users took that data and used it in a patent for better biofuels. Again, we're not putting biofuels in your car. However, we are providing the tools that will allow others to do so down the line. And making our data public and accessible is a huge component of that. Another example that takes us a little bit farther afield involves a microbial genome that was sequenced in 2007. This particular microbe is native to marine environments with very little oxygen and has some pretty unique mobility traits. You can see its interesting little legs extending from the main part of the cell there. I know that that's not the correct term, so I apologize to any biologists in the audience. But in 2014, some Canadian researchers determined that this microbe is extremely effective at delivering cancer drugs to tumors in hard-to-reach areas of the brain. They note explicitly that the genomic data produced by JGI is a really crucial factor in what makes this microbe amenable to usage as a treatment mechanism. So this is really far downstream from us and perhaps quite different than what the original PIs intended for their data, but regardless, a very cool story that could change a lot of lives. Moving on, I'm sure that all of you have heard of Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers. Well, one company that works in the meat substitute sector took some of our public plant and fungal data and used it to patent processes involved in producing things like Beyond and Impossible Burgers. So despite all the opinions on how these things taste, of which there are many, they're definitely more sustainable than traditional burgers, and JGI is playing a role in making them more viable as products. And the final example that I'll walk through is about space, of course, because space is awesome, right? So in the late 2000s, JGI sequences a specific cyanobacterium. In 2014, the PIs whose proposal produced that data leveraged what they received from JGI to determine the mechanisms this bacteria uses to conduct photosynthesis using far red-shifted light. So lo and behold, a few years later, some downstream researchers took the findings of JGI's primary users to determine that these bacteria could be used to produce oxygen for humans on Mars, because of these interesting mechanisms and the interesting scenarios that they conduct photosynthesis. So if I'm going to be living on Mars, it's probably a pretty good idea to develop sustainable methods for producing oxygen that I need to breathe. So with all of these examples, there are a few important things to keep in mind. The first of which is that tangible impact narratives like the one we have on our screen don't really show up until 5 to 15 or so years down the line, and longer in some cases. And this is why it's important for us to keep track of not only who our users are, but also what they're using our products for. So if we have no idea who receives our products and no idea what they're using them for, we can't talk about how we've enabled new biofuels or things like the habitation of Mars. You also may have noticed that many of these are pretty far removed from the PI's original goals, and even from DOE mission areas. However, I really don't think that that's something that we should hide from. Because first of all, we can't control what people do with our things once we make them public. However, we do know that the data that we provide for our PIs has a second life that produces a lot of valuable outcomes that impact people's lives. This indicates substantial compounding returns on the original funding that produced the data, which is a really important argument when justifying the funding that we already received. So now that we have some examples in front of us, I'm going to talk about my favorite topic, actually, which is internal user analytics. So in the next few slides, I'll walk through some examples on how we can leverage data to better understand our users, and hopefully to start thinking about how we can better serve them. So to tie things back to persistent identifiers, all of the following examples that you're about to see feature some components that were made possible using things like ORCIDs and DOIs. All right, so example number one. I touched earlier on the idea of tying downstream outcomes to DOE goals. We can ask ourselves, is it possible to see how outcomes of specific proposals align with the DOE goals outlined in those proposals? Well, that's definitely something that we can look into with the appropriate data in hand. On one hand, we have data on our proposals. We know what's being proposed, we know who's involved, and we know how it relates to specific DOE priorities, because these are things that we all ask our users to report. On the other hand, we have all of these publications that we know our PIs are producing after they receive their data from us. We also know that the fundamental science of our users is influencing other researchers and projects further downstream, which we can identify via citations. So recall some of the examples that I talked about just a few slides ago. So if we can connect our user publications to the proposals that enabled them, we can start seeing how our proposals are enabling all of those fun downstream use cases that come when our users' papers and data get cited. We can make these connections using DOIs, which you see on your screen and which I'll talk about in the coming slides. So let's talk about this example that's in front of you. And this is a real example, I'll note. This particular proposal looks at how fungi in cow stomachs break down plant materials with the hope that these processes can be applied for potential biofuel manufacturing processes. So basically, the idea is that these organisms can sustainably convert plant biomass to useful chemicals. And our users want to know how we can harness that. So our users submit this proposal, and they receive their fungal genomes and their metagenomes, whatever it was that they asked for from us. And they publish a bunch of papers on this data detailing what they found. So these papers are the orange circles that you see on your screen, and then we can connect those back to the proposal, which is the blue circle, with persistent identifiers. So what happens next is that the community starts citing these user publications as well as the data produced through this proposal. I think for this particular proposal, there's something like 500 downstream citations of all of these things that came out of it. And these citations are represented by the green or the gray ovals that you see on your screen. Okay, great. So we have this body of citations. And these citations represent all of the downstream work that's been enabled by our users and their JGI proposal. So here we have a sizable data source that we can start to pick apart to understand how what's eventually resulting from our proposals aligns with the original goals of that proposal itself. And of course, citations are always somewhat of an approximation for impact. They do miss a lot of things, but they do give us a really good starting point to get a better idea in a general sense of what's happening out after we release our things into the world. So using a technique known as natural language processing, which loosely falls in the larger field of machine learning, we can automatically determine which topics characterize our body of citations, and then group those citations based on the topics they're most closely associated with. So for example, taking the 500 or so papers that cite the work that resulted from our original proposal, we see 4 fairly distinct topic groups emerging. One seems to focus heavily on livestock diet and digestion. So remember, these fungi that we're studying live in cow stomachs. Another seems to focus on evolutionary history and the tree of life. Another deals heavily with more general genomic mechanisms. And finally, a 4th topic deals with, well, the breakdown of plant matter for biofuel and other industrial applications, which, if you recall, is pretty darn close to what the original proposal was going for. So we see that about a quarter of the citations resulting from our users' work are pretty spot on with the proposal goals. However, there also seem to be a lot of ancillary uses for our users' data and for their findings. And again, we really shouldn't take this as a bad thing, as in any case, we can't control what the public does with ours and our users' science once we put it out into the world. However, what we can do is leverage this information to, 1, get a distribution of what is actually resulting from our work. So for those papers that are developing topics explicitly of interest to the Department of Energy, we can zoom in on them and start looking for resulting patents and other cool outcomes like the ones that I discussed earlier. And for those topics that are a bit farther off, we can see valuable research in addition to the original proposal intents, which again indicates compounding returns on JGI funding. So recall the example about cancer drugs, for example. That's not a DOE priority, but it is valuable and it is impactful. So with better and more connected user data, we can start to understand what's resulting from all the work that we're doing, not just in the case of individual examples, but also at scale from a high-level perspective. So switching gears a little bit, another question we might want to ask is whether or not there are patterns in how our users associate with each other. Are there identifiable subcommunities within JGI's primary user base? Well, if we take a look at the data, the answer is yes, absolutely, and they show themselves fairly clearly. In this example, I've created a network graph of JGI's primary users based on who shares proposals with who. So here, the dots or nodes are individual users. The lines between them, or edges, indicate shared proposals, and the size of the dots indicates how many proposals a given user has with us. The colorings that you see were produced algorithmically based on proposal relationships. So if 2 users share a proposal, there is a line between them. We can see at least that our algorithm thinks that there are a few distinct groups among our users. And if we take a closer look, we see that these groupings do actually make sense. So the red group that you see is dominated by researchers from DOE's bioenergy research centers, which often work with JGI's plant program. The green group is largely microbial researchers who share lots of connections as a result of JGI's microbial dark matter project and similar initiatives. The blue group consists mainly of fungal biologists brought together through JGI's 1,000 Fungal Genomes initiative. And the purple group contains a lot of folks interested in microbes and metagenomes that don't necessarily associate with any particular large-scale JGI initiatives. And the gray group that you see outlining the rest of the groups indicates older data whose proposal connections have been lost, or folks with one-off proposals that don't necessarily fit into the larger community. And the 2 small, the yellow and the orange group, are more or less offshoots of the red group. All of this is, of course, fine and good, but the larger point is that this kind of thing isn't possible without clean and consistent user records, which are made possible in part using ORCIDs for disambiguation. Can I ask everybody to mute their microphones? I do hear some stuff going on in the background, and I just want to make sure that nothing weird's coming through. I appreciate that. So clearly our folks showed patterns in who they work with. And this begs the question, are there appreciable differences between these groups? Here's where making connections between things like proposals, users, papers, and other outcomes comes really in handy. So in this table, I've taken a few basic characteristics by which we can start to categorize our user groups. How many total users are in each? What do their proposal numbers look like? Where are they located? What types of projects and product types are they interested in? What does their publication output look like? And of course, we can also think of other potential columns, for example, demographic indicators. So why is this interesting? How does this information help JGI be a better user facility? Well, we can start to see exactly how these groups leverage different JGI offerings in different ways. We can ask questions like, how can we better serve each of these groups? Are there other ideal communities or groups that we're completely missing here? How are these groups and their activities fitting into JGI's larger strategic directions? Another point to make here is that all of the types of analyses that I'm demonstrating here can be tied together. So for example, if we wanted to go build topic models based on all of the citations flowing out of any one of these groups, like I talked about a few slides ago, that's definitely something that we can do. Going a little bit further with this example, we can also zoom in on individual user groups. So let's take the blue group in our network, for example. Recall that these folks work mostly with JGI's fungal team. So their proposals produce data that led, for example, to the biofuel and meat substitute impact examples that I mentioned earlier. Their sequencing requests are dominated by fungal and microbial draft genomes and certain types of resequencing products. Though heavily US-based, they do come from all over the world. And about 54% of them have publications leveraging data from their proposals. And on this last point, I'll say that while this 54% number seems low, it's not particularly alarming for two reasons that we can also glean from having better user data. The first of which is that, for one, we know that it takes about a minimum of 2 years after we give people their data for it to start showing up in user publications. So a lot of these analyses are still in the works. And secondly, we know that many, quote, users occupy non-author roles in PI labs and are unlikely to be authors on any publications over time. So the point here is that better connectivity between various data types allows us to start to understand our users at whatever level of granularity are most useful to us given the situation that we're currently in, be that individually, in small groups, or as a unit. Another fun example of what this looks like in practice involves using ORCIDs not only for user disambiguation, but also for tying JGI things to external things like author records in publication indexers like Dimensions, which is the data source I use for most of my publication stuff. So here we have one person that for whatever reason has many duplicate JGI user records. We can use ORCID to bind all of those together. At the same time, that person could also have multiple Dimensions author records, which is their internal individual entities that they use to store author information. However, we can bind all of these together using ORCIDs as well. And finally, having both of these things attached via ORCIDs, we can bring this all together and associate this all with what we know to be a unique individual. So now I can see this person's JGI connections like proposals, co-PIs, product requests, DOE goals, and so on and so forth. And I can also see all of their publications, good data for all of their historical affiliations, and any associated grants, patents, and policy documents that Dimensions may have in their systems. So what can we do with all of our records now that they've been tied together both internally and externally? One example involves using Dimensions and all of JGI's user records to ask, how present are our users in the larger field in which we work? Where do our folks sit in respect to the larger community that they exist in? We can answer this, or at least get an idea of what this looks like, by pulling all of the non-medical, quote, genetics publications in Dimensions, which very, very loosely is the sphere in which JGI operates. Using this data, we can see that apparently our users are on 4 to 5% of all publications all time in this space, which is really not bad for a corpus of about 1 million publications. Of course, the best answers always lead to more questions, and so from here, we can start to ask things like, what are all these other folks in this light orange area doing? Are they working on different research areas entirely? Do they come from different regions? Should we try to engage these folks in some way? Again, these are all important questions as a taxpayer-funded user facility. And here's another way that we can spin data from the same sources. So using our newly disambiguated user records and their external connections, we know that our users in total have published over 200,000 publications. About 1% of those are tied directly to JGI proposals. So again, a user receives their data and they publish on it. That's what that 1% represents. 12% of them build on previous JGI publications, so they're citing previous work, or they're using public JGI resources like our public tools or other public data. And the other 90% or so apparently don't touch JGI at all. So once more, we're left with questions like, what else are our users working on in this red area? Are there ways that we can support them even more than we already do? How are they engaging with public JGI resources as secondary users in addition to what they're getting from JGI proposals? Again, these kinds of things are only possible for us to know if we're intentional about connecting things like users, internal JGI entities, and external data sources. We can also talk about granularity levels in the context of this particular example, as the same analyses are possible with individual users. This is a person who is a real JGI user and a particularly prolific one, and they have 394 total publications. Of those, about half of them cite previous JGI publications or leverage public JGI resources in some way, such as data, tools, what have you. Of those 196 JGI adjacent publications, 63 of them are directly enabled by data that this PI received from JGI proposals. So all of these questions I posed on the previous slide about all users, we can also ask of individual users. And I know that I've been sort of beating everyone over the head with this stuff, so I'll give one final, maybe more simple example. And so a really important question for JGI and its outreach activities is, how do our users first find out about JGI? How is it that new users come to us? Well, because we have disambiguated contact records, and because we can connect those to things like publications, we can get a pretty good idea of who has worked with who and since when within our user community. Putting all of these things together, we can see that about 3/4 of our PIs and co-PIs worked with other PIs and co-PIs before submitting their own proposals. The implication here being that the vast majority of our users come to us via personal networks and word of mouth. So of course, this begs the question, are there other communities out there who may submit successful proposals, but whom we don't currently reach? And if so, why have we not been able to reach them? So as a public user facility, these questions should be at the core of how we go about offering and evaluating our services. So that concludes the example portion. So let's close this circle on persistent identifiers. So a lot of other facilities are integrating these, so I think it's worth touching on what JGI is doing with them. And I'm not going to go into the technical details of the implementations, as that's not something for which I'm responsible at JGI. But if anybody has particular questions about how we're implementing ORCIDs and DOIs, for example, I'd be happy to forward those questions to the folks that actually do work on the implementations themselves. So let's start with ORCID. Over the last few years, JGI is asking both for primary users to provide an ORCID when they submit proposals, and for secondary users to provide an ORCID when they register an account with JGI's data systems. It's my understanding, I think, that the only service we currently ask of ORCID's API is to use their authentication service. So we aren't pushing or pulling any data besides making sure a given ORCID is actually legitimate. And I've already touched on this a little bit, but I think it's worth repeating. And that's that ORCID allows us both to disambiguate folks internally and to connect internal records with records on those same folks that exist in other systems. So to provide some background, JGI's LIMS system has a ton of what we call contact records for our users. But these have been around for a while. They're a little bit messy, and they've undergone at least one migration. And there are instances of duplicates, especially for our longtime users who've submitted lots of proposals. ORCIDs are one tool I can leverage to help create what I call aggregate contact records, which I store in a separate system in which I hand curate. So in terms of external connections, the functionality here allows for some of the analyses that I touched on a few slides ago. So I've created a clean record for a user. What if I want to look at that user's publications? I can't just do that automatically with what we store internally in JGI systems. However, I can tell my system that one contact record should be paired with one or more dimensions author records. Then I can do that. ORCIDs allow me to make those connections because they provide a common, widely used third-party identifier that lives in multiple systems and stays persistent across those systems. So moving on to DOIs, I know that there has been a lot of talk in this group about these things that we call digital object identifiers. In fact, I think the last meeting, we got to hear a lot about what IMSL and PNNL is doing with DOIs. So at JGI, basically what we're doing is assigning DOIs to accepted proposals. It's relatively simple. We do this automatically through OSTI's award DOI service. So what does assigning a DOI to a proposal actually look like in practice? Well, for one, you get this nifty ID number, an example of which you can see at the top. This particular DOI unambiguously refers to JGI's 1000 fungal genomes proposal. Additionally, each proposal gets an OSCE landing page. So when you throw the DOI URL into your browser, it sends you directly to a page that looks like the screenshot that you can see on this slide. So from the OSCE page, users can then navigate to the JGI Genome portal page for all of that proposal's public data. This is just a screenshot, but we can see that some 300 to 400 public data sets are included under the umbrella of this particular proposal. Significantly, users that could navigate to this page don't need to know anything about JGI systems or its system of identifiers to get here, which increases accessibility. So we're assigning these DOIs, and that helps with accessibility. But how does it help with tracking? As of last year, JGI now requires the inclusion of proposal DOIs in publications that are both, one, written by JGI personnel and primary users, and two, that were enabled by those proposals. So basically, the process that we're describing here is that a user submits a proposal, they receive their data from us, they publish on that data, and they put the proposal DOI in their paper. It's relatively simple. What this does is connect proposals to downstream outcomes. So recall the cow stomach example that I talked about earlier. Learning about downstream citations and how they fit into topics that relate to the original proposal was only possible because I was able to connect the initial user publications with the proposal that enabled them. That's how I found all of those downstream citations. Furthermore, because we asked users to put these in their acknowledgement statements, I can identify them using pattern matching in my full text searches. So when a publication comes in that I know is JGI adjacent, I can automatically parse funding acknowledgements for JGI proposal DOIs. And if I find something, I can automatically attach it to that proposal in our systems. So in summary, here's what we're getting from our proposal DOIs. First, they provide stability over time. This is a well-known characteristic of persistent identifiers. So JGI has already migrated systems in the past, meaning that internal proposal IDs have changed in formatting and length and so on and so forth. DOIs are above all of this and persist through any system migrations that might happen in the future. They also increase accessibility. So if you see a proposal DOI in the wild, you know that you can navigate straight to that proposal's data without knowing JGI system. It's something that we just talked about. And finally, and probably most importantly for the topics in this talk, DOIs help us connect the work that we do with its downstream impacts. So specifically, we can connect proposals to user publications that are enabled by those proposals. A user publishes, that leads to a cool patent, which leads to a cool product. Well, now we know exactly what we did to enable that product. So recall, for example, the Mars example that I talked about earlier. The idea that these bacteria provide a viable oxygen source for humans on Mars flowed directly from our primary users' work with JGI data. We know what proposal this flowed from, meaning we know exactly what we did to potentially improve the habitability of Mars in the future, which is pretty cool. And the final identifier type that I'll talk about just briefly is ROR identifiers, which JGI has also started using recently. ROR stands for Research Organization Registry. I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong about that. Please correct me if that's not true. Which, like ORCID, is free, open, and community-led. So what ROR does is assign persistent identifiers to organizations. This is similar to what ORCID does for people. So these IDs look like URLs, and you can see JGIs over here at the top right. So if you follow an ROR URL, they lead you to a landing page that looks like the one you see on the right. So there are some cursory details about the organization, as well as some related organizations and some other identifiers that also refer to JGI. JGI had adopted this type of identifier by adding it to our required auspice statements, like our proposal DOIs. So you can see a few examples of what this looks like on the right. So the work, and then there's a proposal DOI conducted by the U.S. Department of Energy Joint Genome Institute, and then you can see our ROR identifier right there highlighted and in parentheses. So in addition to these DOIs, we ask users to put JGI's ROR ID in their acknowledgement statements. These identifiers provide JGI with functionality similar to what ORCIDs do for individuals. So internally, I can use these things to disambiguate people's affiliations so that we can see where our users are actually coming from. So if we have 50 users from X university, now I don't have to try to find all the different ways that people have spelled, abbreviated, or elaborated on the name of that university in our systems. All I have to do is query for that one single identifier. Externally, I can use these things to unambiguously search for JGI in funding acknowledgements. So with the examples on the right, you can see that searching for, quote, Joint Genome Institute or, quote, JGI can both miss results we do want to collect, which you can see in the first example, and two, capture results that we do not want to collect, which you can see in the second example. So I think that JGI acronym there refers to some petroleum-related organization, which is not something I'm interested in cataloging. So the persistent identifiers like RORIDs are completely unambiguous and avoid both of these issues. So again, on the tracking side of things, these persistent identifiers are helping us disambiguate internal records and to see more easily and clearly what's happening downstream of the work that we're doing. Okay, so with all of that, I hope it's pretty clear that I think persistent identifiers are really, really great and really helpful. But I also want to make the point very clear that I don't think they're a silver bullet, and I think that at least for now, they definitely don't solve all of our issues. They are an essential component of user and usage tracking, but they do require some supplementation. Okay, and this slide is there's a lot to this slide, so forgive the length here. But with DOIs, we have issues with compliance amongst our primary users. We currently see about a 50% compliance rate with folks including them in publication, which results from people not knowing about them or not knowing where to find them. This means that a lot of times I have to manually dive into method sections or supplementary materials of a publication to figure out which proposal is associated. And this is definitely exacerbated with secondary users, who again are folks that come to access, who are not coming through proposals that come to access our public resources. The way that these folks cite our data and public systems is extremely variable and extremely messy. And I think that it's very unrealistic to expect that someone from the general public coming to download some data will add a proposal DOI to their publication, as it's just not what they're used to doing, and we don't have any way to enforce that. With DOIs, there are also granularity issues. So JGI proposals are very large scale and each involve a lot of data. People don't ever really use all the data from a single proposal in a single publication because they're so large scale. So when we see a proposal cited, we don't actually know without some digging what pieces of that proposal are involved. And finally, JGI produces more than data. So if we want to understand our full impact, that is all of the ways that we've helped enable the scientific community, then we need to identify citations of things like software and tools as well as data. These are missed if we only look for our DOIs. ORCIDs and RORs are closer together conceptually and also share some similar issues. So with ORCIDs, though we ask new users to submit them, a lot of older JGI records don't have them. This is a big issue, especially because many of our active users are returning folks with older contact records. So we have to manually backfill many of the ORCIDs for records that came back before we started requiring them. This is very tedious and very manual. Another issue is that many external systems might not have ORCIDs added to their records, and very few systems that I know of have ORCIDs comprehensively attached for all of their users. So Dimensions, for example, which is the publication source that I use, is pretty spotty. So when I match our records with external records, there are often a lot of gaps that I have to fill in myself. ORCID data quality can also be an issue. So I've seen duplicate records, I've seen records that are not very well maintained, and I've seen some records that appear to be manually or that appear to be automatically created that the users themselves don't necessarily have a whole lot to do with. So if I'm trying to look at ORCID and manually see which JGI user might correspond to a given ORCID so that I can backfill them, it's usually pretty difficult to do this. And you know, I've spent a lot of time, for example, browsing LinkedIn to make sure that people's affiliations line up, that I'm not making false associations. It's a very touch and go process. So with ROR identifiers, as with DOIs, we see low compliance with people including them in their OSTA statements, though this is slowly improving. This results from people just copying and pasting acknowledgements from older publications. And it's also due to the fact that many publications happen a long time after people receive their data, as I mentioned. So some users may not have actually engaged with JGI directly since we changed our policy. Internally, we don't require users to submit an ROR ID for their organization. So if I want to add these to our systems, I have to do so manually, both retroactively and as they come in. Similar to ORCID, it's common to find that external systems are not using these types of identifiers, and those that do use them don't have them on every single one of their records. So again, with Dimensions, for example, my publication provider, sometimes I have to manually match between affiliation records in my systems and affiliation records in their systems. And finally, an issue that is particular to organizational data is that hierarchies are a big issue. So what level of organization do we want to store? To provide just a quick example, we have many users who come from the US Department of Agriculture. Do we want to store their affiliation simply as USDA? That has its own ROR identifier. Or do we want to associate them specifically with the USD Agricultural Research Service? That also has its own ROR identifier. Or do we want to associate them with a specific facility within the ARS, each of which also have also has its own ROR identifier. So this decision about which level to include is not always obvious, nor does the affiliation information provided by users make that decision an easy one to make. So two people coming from the same USDA ARS facility could either include the facility itself or include just USDA, and that's something that we'd have to work through. So what does all this mean? Basically, a lot of manually filling in the gaps on our part. So for example, manually assigning publications to proposals, manually disambiguating users and attaching them to external records as well as ORCIDs, and manually disambiguating organizations and attaching them both to RORs and to external records. So for someone like me who wants to try to do lots of fun analysis on our users and what they're up to, I often have to do lots of data cleanup myself before I can even start. Much of this has to do with the fact that while many players in the larger research ecosystem, so individual researchers, funders, publishers, publication indexers, and so on, are starting to adopt these IDs, we're still not 100%, and that leads to a lot of gaps and will likely to continue to do so for the foreseeable future. But that's okay, because despite all of this, word vomit that I've been throwing at you for the last 5 minutes, we're still way better off with the persistent identifiers that we do have than we would be without them. And so I'm definitely very, very thankful and impressed with the start that's been made. All right, so that is pretty much all I have, and I know I'm getting close to time. So to summarize, I'll reiterate the following points. Why are we interested in improved user and usage tracking? Well, one, it helps us discover impact narratives like the one I mentioned earlier. And two, it helps us get a better understanding of our users and our own processes. Persistent identifiers are an important part of this, as they facilitate a lot of unambiguous and automated connections. However, there are still many entities out there that are still slow in fully adopting these persistent identifiers. So in the meantime, we still have to supplement them with manual curation if we want to be comprehensive.